Institute of Philosophy, co-organized by me and Kate Breedenberg at LSE. We are absolutely delighted to have with us today Serene Khader, who's J. Newman Chair in Philosophy of Culture and Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College and Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at CUNY Graduate Center. She's going to talk to us for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A. I'll pass it over to Serene.
All right, I am just going to see if I can share my screen here. Okay, 1 second. Actually, hold on. Let me do it this way, sorry. Okay, so thank you so much to Jonathan for the introduction, and to Jonathan and Kate both for inviting me and for all the organizing work. I should warn you all before I start talking that I had my second dose of the COVID vaccine yesterday. I feel fine, but if I start, you might not be the only person falling asleep in my talk. I hope that's not what happens, but we'll see how it goes. But I'm really delighted to be here and talk with you guys about this project I have been working on about what it means to say that feminist philosophy is a species of non-ideal theory. So many of us here, when people talk about sort of the move toward non-ideal political philosophy or non-ideal ethics in the profession, people often kind of offhandedly describe feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, queer philosophy, and so on as parts of that move toward non-ideal theory. But the reasons for that, or whether feminist philosophy really belongs there, are not often described in a really precise way. So a lot of my goal in this talk is to try to spell out the particular sense in which feminist philosophy is a subspecies of non-ideal theory, but also in doing that to spell out that the concern with the real world that feminists have is actually quite different in kind from the concern with the real world that has dominated more the mainstream Anglo-American discussions of the ideal, non-ideal distinction. So to kind of, especially because I know not everybody is immersed in this distinction, to motivate this talk a little bit, let me first say a little bit loosely about what the ideal, non-ideal distinction is. So around the early 2000s, you start seeing this trend in Anglo-American political philosophy where there's a description of kind of frustration with what is often described in shorthand as a lack of attention to real world problems by mainstream moral and political philosophy. And what that actually kind of translates into in the mainstream Anglo-American literature is largely a concern with action guidance, right? Like what it means to be concerned with the real world in that literature broadly construed is to start looking for theories that will tell us what to do under non-ideal or unjust conditions. Then, as I've kind of mentioned, you often also hear people say that feminism is described, or that feminism is a subset of non-ideal theory. And I think part of the reason for this is that feminists also criticize mainstream Anglo-American political philosophy for lack of interest in the real world. But part of what I'm interested in asking in this paper is, well, is concern with the real world, like is caring about the real world the same thing as caring about action guidance? If it is, or if that's one thing that's entailed by caring about the real world, do feminists mean the same kind of thing when they're concerned about action guidance that more mainstream Anglo-American philosophers tend to mean when they talk about this distinction? So just to motivate the talk a little bit further, I want to describe one reason you might not want to think that feminism is a type of non-ideal theory, despite the fact that it is often assumed to be. And it's this. If you think feminism is a set of first order normative commitments, right? Like if you just think feminism is something like opposition to oppression or opposition to gender-based oppression or support for gender equality or something like that, then it's going to be strange to generate from this set of first order normative commitments a commitment to a particular type of methodology, because we don't say about other first order normative commitments that they commit one to an action guiding versus like an action guiding methodology, right? So we don't say like, if you have the first order normative commitment that each person is an end, or that animal suffering is bad, that therefore your philosophy must be action guiding. We usually say, well, you can believe those things and have an ideal theory, like a non-action guiding theory about it, and have an action guiding theory about it too. So I think, I mean, there's two ways you can go here, right? You can just deny that feminism is non-ideal theory, or you can take the route that I want to take here, which is to say that if feminist philosophy is going to be non-ideal theory, feminism is going to have to involve something more than just a set of first order normative commitments. Feminist philosophizing and feminist academic work are characterized partly by a distinctive set of methods, and that's a lot of what I'm going to emphasize here. So now that I've kind of set up the problem a bit, I'll say a bit more about what I aim to show here and the scope of my thesis. So I aim to show that feminist ethics is generally concerned with action guidance, but action guidance of a specific sort. So I'm going to describe action guidance, or the kind that I'm interested in, as a specific species of fact sensitivity, borrowing from an old paper by Cohen that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. If you're kind of deeply immersed in the ideal, non-ideal debates, you'll know that people describe action guidance in other ways too, including as related to commitments to transitions to greater justice, or in the more kind of Rawlsian framing that non-ideal theory is theory about what we should do under conditions of partial compliance. These aren't the kinds of action guidance I'm going to claim feminist philosophy is interested in. I'm going to claim that feminist philosophers are looking for a certain type of fact-sensitive theory, which I'll spell out more in a minute. My positive view about what feminist philosophy is, in a nutshell, is that it's going to be that feminist philosophy, or feminist ethics more specifically, opposes something that I call oppressive salience idealization. And the story that I'm going to tell about what feminist philosophy is doing is that this phenomenon that I call oppressive salience idealization gets in the way of correctly identifying the problems that our normative concepts are supposed to solve. Including, and this is going to become important, and I think you'll, for like philosophers of science in the room, you'll see I'm like really influenced by philosophy of science and in the rest of this paper, but I am very interested in the ways that problem framing and selection end up influencing the outputs of normative theories, not just of scientific ones. For people who are immersed in this debate, I just want to say really quickly what is a somewhat novel implication of my view. Most of the existing feminist literature about non-ideal theory says that idealization is the feature of oppressive theories that feminists oppose. Much of what I'm going to say for the more techie folks in the room is the implication will be that the existing literature is correct, that idealization is something that is central to the feminist problem with mainstream Anglo-American philosophy, but that the existing literature is also wrong about why and how idealization is a problem. I'm offering, part of what I'm doing here is offering a novel account of the ways that idealization interferes with producing non-oppressive theories. Okay, so I've told you what I'm going to do. Let's do it. I'll start out by explaining what oppressive salience idealization is. Before I explain it, and remember, I'm saying that feminist philosophy opposes oppressive salience idealization, which I'll call OSI at various points in the paper. But before I explain what OSI is, I should say that I have what I think is a pretty non-controversial background assumption in mind, but that's not always salient to everyone when they're thinking about philosophy. And this assumption is that abstraction from our experience of the world features in normative theorizing at many levels. So I think sometimes when people say that theorizing is informed by our experience, they think that that means, you know, something very mundane about how like the normative judgment, I mean, this is also true, right? But that the normative judgments I might draw about this particular applied case are related to my personal experiences with this particular applied case. That's of course true, but I think we need to also remember that abstraction from our experience affects our theorizing at so many levels, right? Like, so it affects our intuitions about cases, but it also can affect things like our choices of theoretical object, the social ontology that we use to divide the objects in the social world into. So just to give a really kind of throwaway example, but that I think that's pretty clear, right? Like Rawls design, like from traditional political philosophy, like Rawls assumes that the object that we're theorizing about that is the object of justice is like a nation state that will have some sort of an industrial economy and where people will have divergent conceptions of the good. Like that isn't the only theoretical object you could think of as the object of justice, right? It's not certainly the object that Plato thought was the object of justice. So why have we come to that? Why did we end up choosing that object? It had partly to do with how the theoretician saw the world and what their experience of the world is like. And you'll see in this paper, I don't think that that's bad. I just think it's inevitable, right? Like we will have to, like when we're encountering the world and theorizing about it, like we will have to draw on elements of our experiences, and it won't always be obvious to us how our experiences are affecting our theoretical outputs. So now that I've described that background assumption, let me say a little bit more about what oppressive salience idealization is. So oppressive salience idealization is the treatment of a view of the world that reflects either the viewpoint of the dominant or disproportionately serves the interests of the dominant as an accurate picture of the world. And this type of idealization, where we take basically either the experiences of the dominant group or like a description of the facts that disproportionately serves the interests of the dominant group as an accurate picture, that can occur at various theoretical levels. Just like I said, that abstraction from our experience can affect our theory at various levels. This oppressive salience idealization possibility is also gonna, like the possibility of it distorting our view of the world is also going to enter into theory construction in a variety of levels. Okay, so I want to explain a little bit why I'm describing oppressive salience idealization as a form of idealization. In much of the feminist discussion of ideal and non-ideal theory, there has been a big emphasis on a distinction that Honora O'Neill drew in the 1980s between abstraction and idealization. O'Neill basically, and actually O'Neill introduced the distinction to quickly make sense of a criticism that she saw within feminism. And she basically said, look, all of this feminist literature, and this is very true of feminist theorizing kind of in the generation before me, right? Like you see abstraction continually called out in feminist theory as the reason that theories end up serving the interests of whites or serving the interests of men. You hear it said that their theories are too abstract. And O'Neill kind of comes back and it says, no, well, I mean, the problem can't be abstraction because theorizing involves abstracting. Like that is just what theorizing involves doing. But she says, the feminists might be onto something. The problem isn't abstraction though, it's idealization. So what's the difference between abstraction and idealization for O'Neill? Well, abstraction involves bracketing certain features of an object in order to theorize about it, especially, bracketing features of particulars. And idealization involves, she says, imputing features to an object that it doesn't actually have. she's of course concerned with the idealization of the person. So she says, like, you know, is the problem with traditional moral theory that it has an abstracted notion of the person, or is the problem that feminists are pointing out that its picture of the person presents that person as impossibly rational, that it presents this person as always reasoning with means and effectiveness, as having a coherent set of goals, as having non-tuistic motivations, and so on. So that's kind of what O'Neill says. I think that, and also I should say, like, the person who really ends up creating a really big conversation within feminism about idealization is my colleague Charles Mills, and much of this paper that I'm giving can be read partly as a response to his non-ideal theory as ideology. But I think that both Mills and O'Neill are right that idealization is the problem. But I think in order to see the way that idealization is the problem, we need to kind of fix some things about O'Neill's definition of idealization. So as I see it, O'Neill says that when we idealize, so I say that she has a stipulative definition of, like her type of idealization is stipulation idealization. On her understanding of idealization, when we idealize, we add features to the object that it doesn't have. So it's not the case that human beings are, you know, are completely rational agents. So saying that they are completely rational agents means giving them an attribute they don't actually have. I think that this is a limited and limiting understanding of what idealization is. And I think that there's another way that and I think actually a more straightforward way that idealization works. And that is by overemphasizing certain features that the object does have and ignoring other features that the object has. Right? Like we could distort an object just by adding too much weight to one part of the object, not just kind of attributing features to the object that it doesn't have. I actually think this is a better characterization of even O'Neill's own example than her characterization is, right? Like, I don't think it's true that humans aren't rational agents. Like, we are. It's just not the only thing that we are. And a moral theory that is built up, like, you know, saying like this is the feature of humans that our moral theory needs to take into account. A lot of what feminists are objecting to is saying, well, you know, we have all of these other features too, right? Like we're interdependent. We act on moral emotions and so on. I also think, just to kind of say something bigger about the history of idealization, I think this is what like the classic examples of idealization involve, right? Like if you think about like the psychoanalytic examples about like idealizing your mother, like, and so in those examples, right, like you think that your mother's world revolves around you. You think that she's this like extremely loving and kind person. So look, I mean, you could have a mother who doesn't care about you and who has, you know, who is like a cold and mean person or something. But I think a lot of the common cases of idealizing the mother are more that like you are emphasizing your mother's relation to you to the expense of your mother's relation to others. And you are emphasizing her positive attributes to the exclusion of the negative ones. So big picture, all that I'm trying to get out of this is the idea that idealization doesn't have to involve just like stipulating that the object has features it doesn't have. Another way idealization can go wrong is when in the practice of abstracting that we have to engage in order to do theory, when we're selecting which kind of features we're going to emphasize in the theory, we emphasize the wrong features. Or we give too much weight to some features. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I just want to give a couple of examples of that I take to be very typical of the history of feminist moral and political philosophy. And I want to just characterize these two examples as straightforward critiques of oppressive salience idealization. So one of them is, the first one is my colleague Charles Mills' criticism of the social contract. So for those of you who are familiar with his work, you will know that there are several, maybe like several hundred criticisms of contractarian thinking in his work. I don't attempt to capture all of them here, but here I want to say something that I think does. What? Oh. I think someone might need to mute themselves.
Bloody thing.
Okay. Okay, sorry, we had to go through a thing where I was muted and then I had to unmute myself. Okay, so here we are. So I think one kind of central point in Mills's thinking, though, is intuitively graspable as this. One way that Western political philosophy has gone wrong is by, and of course, you know, Rawls is held up as the exemplar of this, is by thinking that the central problem that political philosophy needs to solve is the problem of getting individuals with divergent conceptions of the good to cooperate in order to enhance liberty and well-being. So that is, you know, at least in the Rawlsian version of contractarianism, the understanding of what the project of political philosophy is. And then Mills says, yeah, like this is a problem. I don't think that he, you know, especially in his later work where he's clear that he embraces liberalism, he doesn't think that coordination among people with diverse conceptions of the good is not a problem. But there's also another problem that has been completely kind of sidelined in the focus on the problem of, actually, I like to talk about this in a shorthand way to say, like, there's the problem of 1648 and there's the problem of 1492. Like, he says we have this excessive focus on the problem that was generated in 1648. And then he says, but there's an actual other problem that we need to be devoting our moral and political tools to solving. And that is the problem of overcoming the division of the world into persons and sub-persons, which I kind of offhandedly refer to as the problem of 1492, right? So look, there are two problems, at least, right, that moral and political philosophy needs to solve. One of them is the problem of coordinating individuals who have diverse conceptions of the good. Another one is overcoming the division of the world into people and non-people. One of those comes from 1648, one of them comes from 1492. I think one way of understanding Mills's critique is why has the problem of 1648, the problem that is most apparent to you if you are a man from the upper classes, why has that become the problem for political philosophy? And why has this problem been emphasized to the exclusion of the problem that would have been like immediately apparent to people, like, you know, if we had tried to do political philosophy from the perspective of Black people or Indigenous people in 1648 or in 1492, although it hadn't fully happened yet. Another just kind of quick example of what I think, again, I think these are very typical examples of what feminist philosophers do. If you don't have a lot of familiarity, you might have to take my word for it. If you do, and you don't think they're typical, I'd be interested in hearing why too. But another example is Eva Kittay, who was my dissertation advisor, actually, her dependency critique of liberalism. So again, here, she says that, like, look, liberal political philosophy has understood the problem as the problem that political philosophy needs to solve, or the problem that justice needs to solve, as a problem of ensuring coordination among people who are described as fully cooperating over a lifetime. So that, I mean, of course, those are Rawls's actual words. The assumption of full cooperation is not as explicitly described in more historical texts. And then Kittay says, well, but I mean, maybe a better goal would have been, or at least a goal that ought to have accompanied that goal, is the goal of building a polis that will ensure care for people in times of dependency and doesn't exploit people who engage in caregiving labor. So again, here we have this case where the political philosopher has said that something is the case about human beings, which is that they're fully cooperating over a lifetime. Many of them are, but many of them are not. what if we conceived the problem that political philosophy was supposed to solve as one of that included trying to make sure that the dependency that all of us go through, at least in childhood, old age, and times of illness, and which many of us experience throughout our lives, what if that we understood one of the goals of justice as making sure that everybody who received care when they needed it, and that the people who do caregiving labor don't get exploited. So just to kind of bring home the point that both of these are critiques of oppressive salience idealization and not just kind of critiques of having chosen the wrong problem, which is part of it. Both of these theorists, and I think most feminist philosophers in general, make clear that a central cause of this error is that the people engaged in theory construction, or the people who are being read and focused on by people who engage in theory construction, are people who are susceptible to misunderstanding the world, partly because of how they are situated in power. So, I have this question at the end of the slide, but who's most likely to conceive of themselves as independent and fully cooperating? Well, it seems it's much more likely to be that's much more likely to be the case if you are a man whose children are being cared for by a woman, for example, and who lives in a society where the labor of that caregiving is not valued and also often ignored and effaced. It's much less easy to think of people as independent and fully cooperating if you are giving your talk from next to a crib, who is most likely to think of the wars of religion and not colonialism as the defining problem of Western societies. Again, it seems pretty compelling that you might think that colonialism was the problem that Western theorists need to solve if you were living on the other side of colonialism, which is in fact what many decolonial theorists argue. So I've offered those as a couple of examples of how feminists engage in kind of critique of oppressive salience idealization. Now I want to say a bit more about why I think this concern with oppressive salience idealization is well understood as a concern with non-ideality. So let's start with this. I think that the feminist concern with oppressive salience idealization reveals concern with a certain type of fact sensitivity. So, and more particularly with a search for normative principles that are fact sensitive. I borrowed this language from a paper, from an old paper by Cohen that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But basically, Cohen says that principles are fact sensitive if they are only affirmable if certain facts about the world are true. So I think that feminist philosophers tend to also conceive of the type of normative principles we're seeking as of this type. Like, we want principles whose affirmability rests on certain conditions about the world being true. However, and this is a place where I'm going to kind of diverge from some kind of more standard non-ideal theorists, the basic kind of uptake that this paper of Cohen's has gotten in the Anglo-American tradition has been a concern with feasibility, right? Like, the literature that grew out of this Cohen paper embraced it, even though he wrote this paper to criticize fact sensitivity, right? His real worry, to give you guys the background, is that Rawls is too fact sensitive. He's too non-ideal of a theorist. Cohen, but the people who have used the fact sensitivity language from Cohen have tended to say, we want a fact sensitive theory. What is a fact sensitive theory? A fact sensitive theory is a theory that is feasible. So some version of like a fact sensitive theory is a theory like whose prescriptions can actually be discharged by people in the world as it is. So, I mean, to give a very throwaway example, right? Like, if I have a moral principle that generates the action guidance that I ought to solve the problem of climate change by flying from one place to another, like flying with my body, right? Like not with a plane, instead of driving cars or flying planes, the feasibility theorist is going to say, well, this is kind of a crappy theory. Why is it telling me to solve this problem by doing something that I cannot do? So, I mean, I have no problem with thinking about feasibility. I think it's actually very important. And I talk about, I mean, I make a lot of pro-feasibility assumptions at various points in my work. But I think that we should not cede all of fact-sensitive theory over to the feasibility theorist. I think there are other senses in which a theory can be fact-sensitive, and that feminists are primarily interested in another type of fact sensitivity. So what is this other type of fact sensitivity? I want to call it kind of means end consistency. And the basic idea is that principles that are fact sensitive in this way, their affirmability depends partly on whether the results of adopting the theory would be consistent with the rest of the theory. So just to give some examples that I think will illustrate this, because I think actually even non-feminist theorists make claims of this type, but they're just often not identified as such. So I'll give you a couple that might be familiar that might make more sense of this. So for example, in some of his like very early work, Thomas Pogge argued this about humanitarian intervention. He said, like, look, if we actually adopt the principle of humanitarian intervention in the state system that we have, the main result of it is probably going to be more human rights abuse and not less. So we shouldn't adopt the principle of humanitarian intervention. I won't go into too much detail in this, but I think also here, like underlying that claim is a worry about idealization, although not necessarily, arguably, but not necessarily about salience idealization. Part of the concern is that humanitarian intervention is idealizing, like support for humanitarian intervention is idealizing the world so that it says that all of the actors in the state system are more or less equally situated, and that's why it comes out looking like humanitarian intervention will support human rights. In fact, if you look at the world as it is actually structured, the state system is controlled by one or two very dominant countries who are happy to use the human rights regime and military power to secure their interests. So one reason we might want to reject the principle of humanitarian intervention on this kind of concern about means and effectiveness is that the outcome of adopting the theory in the world that we actually live in is going to be an outcome that is inconsistent with the state of affairs that that theory desires to bring about. Similarly, if you want kind of like a less political example, you will often hear in moral philosophy, and this is a claim that's often made by Buddhists, for example, that the belief in a stable self and a stable character gets in the way of being a good person. That type of claim that says like we ought to reject the idea that we have a stable self so that we can actually act in a way that is more consistent with having a good character. Again, here, this is a claim that says like, we are concerned about whether the outcome of acting on a theory will be consistent with what the theory says that it wants. If it's not consistent with what the theory says that it wants, that might be a reason to jettison the theory. Also, I mean, because I say this because people now expect me to talk about decolonial feminism all the time. A lot of my examples in decolonizing universalism kind of have this character, right? Like a lot of what I say is that if we tie feminism too closely to the ideal of freedom in particular, and an ideal I call enlightenment freedom, then we will actually find women all over the world rejecting feminism. And so this might be a reason to come up with another concept of what feminism is. Okay, so big picture, what I'm trying to say here is that there's another way a theory can fail to be fact sensitive besides failing to be feasible. A theory can fail to be fact sensitive by prescribing action in the world that is inconsistent with the rest of the theory. And to tie this to my concern about oppressive salience idealization, my view is basically that oppressive salience idealization gets in the way of the means and consistency of moral and political theories. How does it do that? To put it really simply, oppressive salience idealization gives you a distorted picture of the world. And then what's likely to happen, so then your theoretical outputs are going to be suited to another world that is not the world whose problems we are actually trying to solve. So I just like to say a little bit, kind of spell out in a little bit more detail how that looks, what that looks like, how oppressive salience idealization undermines the fact sensitivity of normative theories. Again, because I think there's kind of a throwaway obvious understanding of what I'm saying, and I'm trying to say something deeper than that. So the obvious level that fact sensitivity can, or like lack of fact sensitivity can get in the way is just that, you know, we can apply the theory wrongly because we have a wrong picture of the world. But I think that's kind of the least, I mean, it is interesting and problematic, but it's the least kind of philosophically interesting way that oppressive salience idealization can undermine the fact sensitivity of normative theories. So I'd like to kind of illustrate some less obvious ways that fact sensitivity can, or lack of fact sensitivity can undermine normative theories. So another way is by introducing error at the level of problem selection. So one way I've focused on so far is that, look, you could just omit problems that you need to be talking about, right? Because you're focused on the problems of the dominant, you can omit the problems of the oppressed, right? Like you're focused on 1648, you forget to talk about 1492. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because selecting the problem in the wrong way could lead to other sort of deeper theoretical problems besides just overlooking. So I'd like to describe a couple of those. So one is that you could end up, because of focusing too much on the problems of the dominant, with a theory whose outputs actually impeded solving the other moral problems. So it's not just that you fail to see 1492 because you're focused on 1648, it's that because you were too focused on 1648 and you didn't see 1492 as a central problem, you actually produced theoretical outputs that, or prescriptions, to put it, you know, more simply, that get in the way of solving the problem of 1492. So just to give a kind of straightforward example of that, right, like so much of what critical race theory ends up saying about liberalism is, look, like you have built this this normative apparatus that makes attempts to solve racism seem, or not solve racism, right? Like to you know, do something about racism now appear like they are violations of basic moral principles. So now you end up with, like, if you are so focused on protecting people's conceptions of the good, well, then it becomes very hard to talk about what should be done when people hold racist conceptions of the good, especially, you know, to get into the details, right? If you hold them in your house and don't hold them when you supposedly don't hold them when you go decide who to vote for. Similarly, right, like this is a common argument made in like the feminist critiques of pornography, for example, is that like once you build this like very particular understanding of freedom of speech into the theory from the outset, then attempts to do something about pornography, for example, are now, the theory is now stacked so that attempts to do something about pornography look like very strong rights violations that they didn't necessarily need to look like if the theory had not been constructed in that way. There's another way, so another way that oppressive salience idealization could lead to a theory whose prescriptions got in the way of solving the important moral problems is also like performatively. So I actually take this to be a lot of Mills's point. Once a kind of moral or political philosophy becomes kind of sedimented into like the public culture or self-understanding of a society, there's a worry that the description of society that is offered by that theory, whether or not it was intended as an accurate description of society, can end up becoming that society's self-conception, even if it's false. So I put that really abstractly, but I think when I give Mills's own example, it'll become clear what I mean, right? And I think Mills claims this about race. I think McKinnon claims this about gender, right? Like, once you keep claiming over and over again that people are equal in your theory and it becomes sedimented onto social ideology, then people start to believe, well, people are actually free and equal. And then this impedes your attempts to solve gender inequality and racism, because like when you try to do something about racism, people keep claiming that trying to do something about racism treats people as unequal when they are actually already equal. I want to check one thing. Okay. Let me list kind of one other way, I'm coming close to 40 minutes here, that oppressive salience idealization undermines the fact sensitivity of normative theories. And it's that choosing the wrong problem can also cause like what I call shoehorning, which is basically trying to make a problem that afflicts oppressed people fit the contours of a theory, but in order to slot it into the theory, you have to distort the actual like moral or political problem that I'm talking about. So here are some kind of throwaway examples of that. People have often responded to Kitay's work by saying, actually, this was Nussbaum's response to Kitay in a kind of well-known article in the New York Review of Books, where she said, like, to Kitay, why can't we just keep the Rawlsian apparatus and make care a primary good? Well, you could do that, but there's a lot of ways in which that might end up resulting in outcomes that are not consistent with what feminists would want. Or there's also a bunch of ways in which it ends up throwing a larger wrench into the Rawlsian apparatus than people would want to throw. So an obvious wrench that it throws is that, like, how do you decide who the least well off are once you have other goods besides income in play in the difference principle? So for example, I'm bringing this up just to say, look, there might be ways in the Rawlsian framework to try to care about caregivers and to care about people who need care. But if the theory was constructed from the bottom without concern with care in mind, the slot in the theory for introducing these new concerns may not be the one that is most useful for solving the problems that were initially excluded. Similarly, another solution that the Rawlsian framework would offer for trying to accommodate care would be to say, well, look, what if care is just another chosen life plan? But of course, this misses the fact that which life plans we choose around care is strongly related to things like gender socialization and the devaluation of caring labor. So again, here, it just seems like if you make care into a chosen life plan like any other, you're definitely going to end up with theoretical outputs that disadvantage women. And other people who are caregivers, but especially women. Similarly, and this is kind of the criticism that Iris Young levied in the early 1990s when in Beyond the Distributive Paradigm, but the difference principle assumes that, that goods are being distributed according to a market, but doesn't leave any way of asking questions about justice about what the market values. So that's a problem because we live in a background context where the market devalues care labor. Rawls's theory has kind of just put outside of the theory, like, as this isn't a question for justice. How did the market start to decide valuing productive labor more than reproductive labor or something like that? So I have some more slides, but I think that they get very techy. So I think I'm more interested in just having a conversation. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have or discuss any comments you guys might have.